Hello watch lovers, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have this Rolex Explorer II on the bench. Or do we? This is my friend Franco's watch and he was worried it might be a fake because he got it for a good price. Not super cheap, but quite good price. And the thing is, fakes nowadays are so good, it's nearly impossible to tell the difference. The watch on the right here, for instance, is sold for $200 something. That watch is a fake of the next generation Explorer II, but still. So for Franco's watch, we see the case back. It has some strange marks around the rim. The case looks absolutely genuine. It does have the Rolex serial numbers, but honestly, that's also easily faked nowadays. Apart from that, the case is in good condition. It has been polished as pretty much all Rolexes, but the screw-down crown works as it should. A little bit sticky, but that's alright for a watch that hasn't been serviced for a long time. And we see we can set the hour hand the way we should, and that's also how the quick set date works on the Explorer II. So it seems to be good in that sense. Let's check the time grapher if it's the correct beat rate. And yeah, it is, and it runs well as well. So it looks to be genuine in that sense, but as mentioned, the real test is opening the watch up and look at the movement. So we're going to use our trusty case back opener to open the case up. Very important we have the correct die for this. And now the moment of truth. Blimey! Oh, hang on. That was the wrong watch. Oh, here we have the proper watch. Okay. Phew! Now there are various levels of the fakes as well. You have, let's say, the Ibiza beach salesman fake, which costs probably $50 to make. And there you will immediately see it when you open the watch up. But then you have the super fakes. And super fakes might be relatively costly also. So you might have to pay, let's say, $1,000 for a super fake. It means the makers have invested to make a proper watch and make it look as closely as possible to a Rolex, even with the movement. So the only surefire way, as of yet at least, is to look at the balance. Since the late 1950s, Rolexes used free-sprung balances. So on the left here you can see one of those where there is no index, no regulator. Whereas on the right we have an index. And the reason is that free-sprung balances take quite a lot of effort to adjust. So that would be more costly. So that's the really surefire way of making sure that the Rolex you think you have is real. Of course, a golden rule in life is that if something seems too good to be true, it probably isn't true. So keep that in mind whenever you buy any kind of watch. As you might imagine, Franco was very happy when I told him that this is a genuine Explorer II. The reference is 16570 and it has the Rolex 3185 caliber. And as I'm sure quite a few people know, these movements weren't actually made by Rolex proper. Initially, Rolex used more standard grade movements, like FHF movements. They quite early started working closely with the Egler family. So even before the Second World War, Egler became the kind of de facto manufacturer for Rolex and only Rolex. But they didn't actually acquire Egler until 2004. So that's when they become truly in-house. Alright, I mentioned that this is the caliber 3185, and this assembly here is the main difference between the 3185 and the 3186, which is used in later Explorer II versions. It's a pretty complicated piece that's used for the GMT hours to be able to quick set. And that was simplified quite a lot in the next version of the movement. So the movement is part of the 3135 family. So most of the movement is exactly the same. You just then have the added GMT function. So here we have the free sprung balance. So it's regulated with these little screws on the inside of the rim. That's a Rolex patent. It's called the Micro Stella because those screws look a little bit like stars. And yes, you do need a special tool to adjust them. So we'll see if we need to use that in this video. Otherwise I have another Rolex video where I do that. So down to the base movement. It's relatively straightforward, but a few quirks. So these movements are very nicely finished and they're a pleasure to work on. They're just very high quality. Everything falls into place, so that's very nice. It does have a couple of strange things, however, and one is the way they implement the central seconds. It's a pretty old school way with having cannon pinion and then having the central seconds directly driven through it. But Rolex was never known for thin watches. And it is a solid movement for sure. Over on the dial side, we have the keyless works, which is also a little bit different from most other manufacturers. And someone used a lot of grease in this keyless works. So Franco mentioned to me that the watch stopped every now and then, which is likely just due to the dirt and the quite excessive oiling here and there. And of course we saw on the time grapher that the performance wasn't great, but still it was keeping okay time. Having taken all the components off the main plate, we're now left with the underside of the different bridges and then also the automatic module. Rolex automatic modules use these reverse wheels with that typical purple color. I'm going to see a little bit more detail when I assemble a watch again, how the reversing wheels work. But for now we're just going to take them off. So I had to go to the dentist the other day, and I think I might have mentioned this before, that I believe there are mainly two career choices for sadists. It's either becoming a dentist or becoming a tax return consultant in the government. And of course the more hands-on sadists would then choose dentistry. And here's a fun fact. As the torturer profession started shrinking in the Middle Ages, the dentist profession started growing. Now I just leave that to you. Do you think that's pure coincidence? I think not. That said, it is certainly a much more pleasurable experience now than when I was a young boy. Back then I first had to walk on foot through 2 meters of snow for 3 hours just to get to the dentist. And then the dentist didn't have anything like cooling, so the drill might even get too warm for your teeth. So it was very unpleasant. Anyway, we managed to take the watch apart. We cleaned the pivots a little bit as well. And then we're going to put everything into the cleaning machine. Well, as I much too frequently do, I'm lying to you. I'm not putting everything into the cleaning machine. I'm leaving the very fine springs and so forth, and also the screws. The springs and plastic parts, that kind of thing, just clean manually in a jar. And the screws, unless they're rusty or dirty, that kind of thing, I just leave them. I also wanted to thank all my members, both on YouTube and Patreon. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it. The members get access to exclusive videos, including tips and tricks, how-to videos, more technical versions of the public videos, and so forth. And we have a really good community on Discord. So if you're interested, check that out at the join button below here or at Patreon on this URL. And no, I have no idea who the other 88 Vintage Watch Services is on Patreon. Anyway, we are going to also clean the case. So I'm taking off the bezel first. I'm using this tool for that as well. You can use a simple case knife, but the risk of damaging the bezel or the case is quite significant. You might have also noticed that the number 6 on the bezel is a little bit worn. So I'm not going to put the bezel through the ultrasonic for that reason. And if you're not familiar with the ultrasonic sound, then brace yourselves. It is not pleasant. Alright, with the movement parts back from the cleaning machine, we are going to treat some of them, the escapement parts, with Epilam, a product called Fix or Drop. That makes the lubrication stay better in place. Not really needed unless you do this for money. But if you do charge for servicing a watch, you really should use it. It does extend the life of the service a bit. After submersing the parts in the Fix or Drop, we're going to clean the pivots on the escape wheel and also the pallet fork. That way there's not going to be any residue from the Fix or Drop. So the Fix or Drop leaves a very thin film on top of the surface. That film actually stays there for a few cleanings. So if you treat a part with Fix or Drop, you should be able to clean the watch a few times and it should still have an effect. So we put a little bead of oil in the middle of the capstones, and then we put this other little part, the chateau or the bearing, on top. And they will stay together as one unit. Then we can put them back into the balance. It's this little spring on each side, one on top and one on the bottom. And with those in place, the balance should oscillate freely. Let's see. We don't really need a strong puff. We just want to see that the oscillations do not slow down very easily or very fast. So that looks alright. Okay. Back to building the movement. We're going to do the lubrication of the barrel first. Given that this is an automatic watch, we're going to put some braking grease around the wall of the barrel. And also put some lubrication, some grease at the bottom of the barrel. Not braking grease, but just regular lubrication grease. If we put in a new mainspring, we wouldn't have to lubricate the barrel drum. But we will still have to put braking grease on the barrel wall. So the mainspring is the only power source in a mechanical watch. So we basically wind it up into a big coil. And then we place that into the mainspring barrel. And as it unwinds, it's then going to drive the train of the watch. There we go. The barrel arbor then goes into the center of the mainspring. There's a little hook on the barrel arbor that fits into an eye in the mainspring. And then with a screw we're gonna tie that barrel arbor to using the crown. So that's how we wind the watch. Of course also with the automatic module in an automatic watch. Alright, there we have our barrel. We're also going to lubricate the barrel arbor bearing a little bit. And basically lubricate everywhere there is friction. But the amount of lubrication we use is very, very small. The oil I'm using here, for instance, we typically buy it in a 5 milliliter jar, or a vial, I suppose. And those 5 milliliters will probably last you like 2 years. And that's one of the most used oils. So we use very, very tiny amounts. Right? For this specific movement and also the 3135 family, it might actually be better to start building it from the keyless works. We'll see the reason why. Why, Rolex? Why? We'll see the reason why in a short while. Let's just first have a look at the shock setting for the escape wheel. When I took this out in the first place, the shock setting spring actually came loose. That can happen. If it does, it's actually relatively easy to put back in place. You just have to press it onto this wedge-shaped block, I suppose. And then we can oil that shock setting from the underside before we put it in place. So as I was saying, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. Sorry, I have 2 cats, so I really shouldn't say that so they might hear it. Speaking of cats, I think it's quite certain that cats are the most intelligent creature that ever existed. Because I tell you, they really got it figured out. They must have the best lives of any creature. As long as they purr and stroke you a little bit, and we give them food and shelter and all kinds of stuff, and they don't do anything in return apart from purring. Back to the movement. This is the hack that we're putting in, and as you can see, it has this little hole at the back, and that hole needs to fit into a part of the keyless works. So that's why it's perhaps better to start building it from the keyless works side. We always want to make sure that the train runs freely before we screw down the screws, because it's much too easy to break pivots. Alright, we're moving over to the other side of the main plate, the dial side, and we're going to assemble the keyless works. The keyless works is where you have the most momentum, the most force, the most friction. So here we use some special lubricants that are designed exactly for that. You might have noticed that beautiful blue colored one. I'm going to use that same one for the cannon pinion as well. But for all the other things on the dial side, we use relatively thinner oil. The keyless works on these watches is a little bit different from what you might be used to from other brands. And for this movement, or this movement family, as I mentioned, the hack has this little hole at the back there. And there's a little nubbin on the setting lever here that has to fit into that hole. So if you don't pay attention to that and make the setting lever fit properly, then you will not be able to perform all the functions of the keyless works, and you might damage things as well. So if you do build this movement from the keyless works up, then of course you will see that little nubbin, and then you can put the hack onto it. Alright, with the setting lever spring in place, we can test that the keyless works does its job. Given how this watch is built, we're not going to put in a time setting train quite yet. We don't really need it to make sure that the movement runs properly. So in order to do that, we need to put in all the components for winding the watch. Again, a little bit different on Rolexes. You have this rocker for the crown wheel, which is a pretty cool way of doing it, I must say. So I wanted to tie a few more comments to this whole faking. So the brand that's most commonly faked is Rolex. And the reason for that is that Rolex is probably the most overpriced watch brand. Start the flame war! One might of course argue that all luxury watch brands are overpriced. And yes, they certainly do have pretty high margins. But Rolex probably has the biggest margins of anyone. Their watches are not at all complicated, and the finishing isn't extremely good in any way. Nice watches, but quite simple watches. But they do command very high prices. And there's of course a lot of people wanting to get their hands on a Rolex. So all in all, that makes Rolex the prime target for faking. And honestly, there probably are quite a few people who like to have something on their wrist that looks like a Rolex and don't mind if it's a fake even. So we lubricated the pallet stones and the escape wheel. And now we can put the balance in and see if this baby wants to start up. And yes, it does. It is a beautiful movement for sure. Not crazily finished, but very high quality. It's always nice to work on Rolex movements. Things just sort of fall into place, so that's very nice. We're oiling the last few jewel holes, and then we're going to put it on a demagnetizer and the time grapher. Alright, that was easy. Good amplitude, good rate, everything right off the bat. So then we don't have to regulate the watch anymore. So let's then get on with the calendar and the GMT functions. So the first thing we're going to do is put on the cannon pinion. That's this part that translates the motion from the train to the dial side. With that one in place, we can then lubricate all the different posts and then put in first the time setting train. And this movement has this little bit special cover plate. This little wheel on top of the plate here meshes with intermediate wheel underneath. And then there's another wheel that we're going to place next to it that allows us to set the GMT and consequently also change the date. We're going to also put on the time setting wheel before we put on this assembly for the GMT. This is the assembly for the GMT. So those two jumpers and that spring there, they mesh with the teeth on the inside of this jewel plated wheel. And if you count the number of teeth, how many teeth do you think you will have? So this is what allows the hour hand to jump 1 hour forward. So in general, you shouldn't even need to disassemble this one actually. And if you do, then you certainly do not want to take out that spring and those jumpers. And getting those back in place is very fiddly work. We also have this fragile little double wheel there that together with that assembly is the main things that were changed in 3186. So to improve upon those fragile pieces and somewhat over-engineered. So Rolex is known for having this instant jump over date. And that is achieved by a couple of components here. We have this massively strong spring. And then we have that date corrector with that little jewel at the end. And that jewel then rolls against that snail wheel on top of the date corrector wheel. So when the date corrector wheel reaches a certain point, the jewel will roll off the snail and very quickly change the date. I'm going to see that in a little while. And that little jewel on that date corrector lever, you really do not want to lose that one. That spring is very, very strong, so taking it off, it can happen that it pinks away. And you really don't want to lose that jewel. It's going to be quite expensive to find a replacement. Alright, with a date jumper in place on the underside of this date plate, we can then screw the plate down and put on the date disc. The date disc fits under a couple of these small discs in the plate. And then we have this little lever we turn to make sure that the date disc stays in place. Let's see the jump over. That is pretty instant. So with that we can put the dial back on, and then we are going to also put the hands on. We're going to do some black magic here with the hour hand. It might look like we're misplacing it. But wouldn't you know? And then we can put the GMT hand at the same time. But then you can, of course, jump the hour hand later if you want to change the time zone you're in, for instance. All right, let's also put on the minute hand and the seconds hand. When I'm pressing the hands on, I have the movement in this holder. And this holder has a support on the underside that helps the central jewel not be pressed out. And that is a real risk, especially with movements like the 2892. All right, let's have a little bit closer look at this instant changeover date. And we see the date changes at about 5 minutes to, and that is pretty much perfect. When the watch is doing it by itself, it's going to change over a few minutes later. All right, time to rebuild the automatic module. And if you worked on other Rolex movement automatic modules, this one is very similar. A few differences, of course, over the generations. Perhaps most notably this quick release for the rotor. But the way it works is basically the same. This reverser wheel here meshes with that wheel from the rotor, and then it meshes with the other reverser wheel, and then they both mesh with the driving wheel. It's a bit complicated to explain in detail how they work, but essentially the purple reverser wheel and the pinion inside of it will lock or unlock depending on the direction. And ultimately the result is that the driving wheel always goes in one direction. And with that we can put in the cover plate and lubricate the jewels. And then we're pretty much ready to put the automatic module back on. We're only going to do that after casing the watch. First we're going to have a look at the bezel. So at 6 o'clock that numeral is a little bit worn. So we're going to try to rectify that with some black paint. I'm doing this under the microscope, so the colors are a little bit distorted. I basically just fill the missing area with black paint. And when we have a little bit too much, we can just use pegwood to take it off. And the end result looks pretty okay. All right, let's put the case back together. Franco didn't want the case polished, apart from cleaning up the case back a little bit. So we're going to do that. We're first putting in a new crown tube gasket. And then we can put in the other gaskets. The bezel on these watches should fit very snugly to the case. And with a rather thick rubber gasket that gives a good seal for water intrusion. And then I'm putting the crown into the case. That gives a little bit better alignment for putting on the bezel. And then I'm using this press to put the bezel tightly onto the case. And these presses do generate quite a lot of force, so we're protecting the case and the bezel. And there we go. After cleaning the crystal, we can then put everything back together. Of course, Rolex has this somewhat peculiar way of securing the movement in the case. We screw this case screws up instead of down. It's a very neat way of doing it, and it works very well. And then we can put the automatic module back on. And before screwing it down, I put a little bit of pressure on the crown in the winding position. That way the automatic module will fall into place and start meshing with the rest of the movement. Some silicone on the gaskets help them stay supple for longer. I mentioned the case back. So what we're doing with the case back is basically just brush it. We use 320 grit. And yes, I know you can see my hand more than the case back, but this is the result. Just a simple cleanup of the case back. We're not doing anything other than taking away those marks that were there. Before seeing the watch on the wrist, just want to remind everyone that at vintagewatchservices.eu you will always find more than 100 beautiful vintage watches. And as a YouTube subscriber, you can use this code for 10% off. And there we have it. Franco's beautiful and genuine Rolex Explorer II, reference 16570. And yes, he also does have the original bracelet for it, so I put that on for the video. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. I'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.